Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at the first political parties in America and the John Marshall Court. Those are going to be the two biggest topics of this particular lesson. So let's go ahead and get started here. The first thing we want to talk about are the first two political parties that were created in America. And the leaders of those two parties were, of course, Alexander Hamilton on the left and Thomas Jefferson on the right. Both of these men were in George Washington's administration. You know, it would never work that way today where we would put two people in different parties in Donald Trump's administration or in Barack Obama's administration. That just would not happen. But back then we didn't have political parties, so these were two of the smartest men, two of the smartest founding fathers we had, and so George Washington was smart to put them in his cabinet. But as it turns out, these two men had very different views on how to lead the country. And so Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of Treasury, is going to start a movement that develops into the Federalist political party, the Federalist. And then Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, is going to start a movement that really leads into the party called the Democratic Republican Party. These two parties are not like the two parties we have today. They're very different, but they were two political parties, the first two political parties back then, and they are going to have very different views for how America should run and how America should work. And so we're going to look at those views now. Let's start with the Federalist. Of course, this is led by Alexander Hamilton. The Federalists, of course, are going to believe in a strong federal government or a strong national government. Federal and national government mean the same thing. So that's one way you can remember that is it's in their name. They believe in a strong federal government. When it comes to the wars between Britain and France and their foreign policy, Federalists supported Britain. Their view was that we had more in common with Britain to begin with. You know, after all, we came from Britain. So the Federalist view was that we should support Britain over France. We don't have as much in common with France as we do with Britain from their point of view. They wanted at least Hamilton did, as a Federalist, wanted the federal government to take over the states' debts. And what happened is after the Revolution, you have all these states that have a lot of debt and they don't know how they're going to pay it off. From Hamilton's perspective, the federal government should take all of that debt and pay it off together. Now, that may seem like states would want that, but a lot of states did not want that to happen because they understood if the federal government took over their debt, that would mean the federal government would have authority over them and would be more powerful than they were. And so they didn't want that. It's sort of like if you think about, you know, if somebody loans you money, you sort of owe them something, don't you? So you might not want to take that loan because you're like, well, they're going to ask me to do all these favors for them. And they get to determine what I do with that money. And so that's how some of the states viewed this. But the Federalists supported that. They liked that idea. The Federalists believed a national bank was in our best interest. They believed that it was fine constitutionally to have a national bank. The Democratic Republicans said no, that we cannot have a national bank because the Constitution doesn't give the government authority to create a national bank. So because of that, Federalists believed in what we call a loose construction of the Constitution, meaning that you can read things into the Constitution, that the Constitution isn't hard and set, that it actually can change with the times, and that actually things like the necessary and proper clause, which says that Congress can do anything that's necessary and proper, that you can interpret that broadly to mean anything you view as necessary you can do. So that would give the federal government much more power. So you get the idea here. Federalists were about the government, the federal government, having much more power. And so they believed in what we call a loose construction of the Constitution. They interpreted the Constitution loosely. They're going to favor industry over agriculture. They believed the future of America was in industry, so they wanted to pour money into things that would help industry. They wanted to create something like a tariff. A tariff would be a tax on imported goods. So any goods coming into the country, they said that we should put a tax on that so that Americans would, instead of buying those foreign goods, would buy the American goods. That, of course, is favoring industry, and that's what the Federalists did. And then because of they favored industry, they're going to be more popular in New England, in the North. You know, New England didn't have a lot of plantations with a lot of cash crops. So if you favored industry, that actually was to the benefit of New England. And so New England is going to favor the Federalists more than the southern states are. All right. Any questions so far? Let's move forward. All right, let's talk about the Democratic Republicans. Okay, the Democratic Republicans are going to be led by Thomas Jefferson. All right, and Thomas Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, is adamant that the United States must support France. His reasoning is, number one, France helped us in the American Revolution, so we sort of owe them. But number two, France is undergoing around this time, actually it was a little bit before this, but they were undergoing their own revolution, and their revolution, in his view, was a democratic one similar to ours. Now, the Federalists did not see it that way at all. The Federalists said, actually, France's revolution was violent. It was much more violent. It wasn't a war between two armies. France was executing politicians and executing monarchs and cutting off people's heads, and that is not how we did things in America. So the Federalists said that France is not like us at all. But from Jefferson's perspective, the overall point of the French Revolution was to bring democracy, to bring more freedom to people, and therefore they're like us, and so we should support them. The Democratic Republicans did not want the federal government to take over state debt. They didn't want the federal government gaining any more authority or any more power than they already had. Because they believed the federal government did not have authority not granted in the Constitution, they believed a national bank was unconstitutional. Their view was that Hamilton's version of this national bank was wrong and that he did not have the authority to create this bank. They believe in a strict construction of the Constitution, meaning that they believed the Constitution has to be interpreted exactly as it is written. If the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the authority to do something specifically, then the federal government cannot do that thing. I'll give you an example. Nowhere in the Constitution does it mention the federal government has authority over education. So from the Democratic-Republican view and from the strict constructionist view, only the states can control education. Now, if you look at our country today, our federal government is involved somewhat in education. Now, it's mainly a state issue, but we see that the federal government does have some involvement. So somebody who believes in strict construction would say the federal government should have no involvement in education because that's not in the Constitution, that they have that authority. You sort of get the idea of the differences here between the strict constructionists and the loose constructionists. Okay, the Democratic Republicans are also going to favor agriculture, and that's that picture down at the bottom. That's a plantation. And, you know, it's not like most people lived on a plantation in the South, but it is the fact that the economy of the South is going to be run by plantations. So even though the majority of people are poor farmers, plantation owners are going to be the ones who control the economy, they control politics, they control social life. They're just that important. Planters are to the Southern society. And so those Democratic Republicans are actually going to favor those plantation owners over industry. And because of that, they are more popular in the South. All right, so those are the big differences between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. You need to know those two parties specifically. All right, let's move on to another event that we need to talk about, and that is an event that happened under the presidency of John Adams. Okay, so George Washington actually leaves office after 2 terms. He voluntarily leaves, which is setting a precedent for the future presidents to leave after 2 terms. Today it is mandatory that you can only serve 2 terms, but to begin with it was not. But Washington left, and the guy that took his place is named John Adams. Now, John Adams is one of my heroes. I love John Adams. I just think he was one of the great founding fathers. If it weren't for John Adams, we never would have voted to gain our independence from England. You know, it was Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence, but it was John Adams who argued for that declaration. He argued in the Continental Congress that all colonies needed to vote for independence, and ultimately his argument's going to win. So I just love John Adams. But during his presidency, which many people view as a failed presidency, we're going to have an issue with France. And the issue is France is attacking our trade ships. So like any country would do, we're trading with the powers of the world. And back then, the two great powers of the world were England and France. So we send trade ships over there constantly, and neither side really likes us trading with the other. England doesn't want us trading with France because they hate France, and France doesn't want us trading with England because they hate England, and they're at war with each other quite a bit. Well, England is going to attack our trade ships at different points in history, but at this particular moment in history, when John Adams was president, it was France who was attacking our trade ships. And the result was, John Adams says we've got to send ambassadors over to France to negotiate some kind of treaty to get them to stop this. Now, Adams understood that we are a very young country. We had very little power. Yes, we had defeated England during the Revolutionary War, but nobody believed we could win another war with England or France. And so he understands we have very little to negotiate with. But he still sends ambassadors to France anyway. When our ambassadors get to France, they are greeted by three French officials, Monsieur X, Monsieur Y, and Monsieur Z. They didn't call them by their real names because what those French ambassadors asked for was a bribe. Now, we understood if we had outed their names, if we had said this particular person asked for a bribe, that would have definitely caused a war with France because it would have been such an embarrassment to France. So we were smart enough to at least keep their names secret. So we called them Monsieur X, Monsieur Y, Monsieur Z, or Mr. X, Y, and Z, and it became known as the XYZ affair. Our ambassadors immediately said, no way, no how. We are not going to give you money to negotiate a treaty with us. That is not how friendly nations deal with one another. You're treating us like you're a bully and we're the one being bullied, and that's not right. So our ambassadors immediately left, came back to America, and reported to President Adams what had happened. The result was a semi-war with France. Now, it wasn't an actual all-out war, but we did have some naval battles with France, and that's why it's called the quasi-war. Quasi means almost or semi-war. The tensions continued to rise and went up and up and up until finally President Adams is going to be able to negotiate a treaty with France and avoid war. Now, in doing so, he actually alienates himself from both parties. You know, technically, Adams is a Federalist, but the Federalists demanded war with France. They were so upset with how France treated us, they demanded that we go to war. So when Adams negotiated a treaty, his own party turned against him. At the same time, the Democratic Republicans, who favored France, they didn't like how Adams was dealing with France at all. They thought that Adams was being too harsh with France, and so they hated Adams. So basically, you have a man stuck in the middle. Now, one of the reasons I respect John Adams so much, even as president, who many people view as a failed president, I would say that he's not a failed president. Yes, he only won one election, and he lost his re-election attempt, but he lost because he did the right thing. He kept us out of a war we could not win. And in keeping us out of a war, it's going to be better for America, even though it was bad for him politically. We need more politicians to act like that, I think. Okay, let's talk about John Adams' worst move as president, and one that is why many people consider him a failed president, and that is the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, so we've got two responding resolutions against each other. The first is going to be passed by the Federalists in Congress. They're called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what those acts did was it made it illegal to basically to speak out against the government. Now, the way the Federalists portrayed it, they said, all you Democratic Republicans who are criticizing President Adams and who are talking trash about our government, trying to go to war with France, that actually is treason, and therefore you can't do that. Now, we know that that violates the First Amendment. That's the basic part of the First Amendment, is that we have the freedom to speak out against our government. But what this law did, the Alien and Sedition Acts, is that it made it illegal to have free speech, basically. So it violated the Constitution. Now, it's not going to last very long because it does violate the Constitution, but in doing this, the Federalists are going to outrage the other side. The Democratic Republicans are going to respond to the Alien and Sedition Acts with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. In Kentucky and Virginia, those two states passed resolutions that basically said that states can nullify or disobey, that's another word, get rid of, but states can nullify acts of Congress they believe are unconstitutional. Now, this is not good for the country, guys. This put the whole future of America in jeopardy. If you have a government, a state government that's saying we are not going to obey a law of the federal government, then you can't really have a federal system. That's not going to work. One of the things that you have to have in a federal system is the rule of law. You have to have people that agree, no matter if we agree with the law or disagree with the law, we're going to obey a law. But what the Kentucky and Virginia resolution said is, no, if a law violates the Constitution, we don't have to obey it. So this is a really sticking point here between these two sides. And guys, I want you to see something here. This is something that isn't new. This is something we're going to deal with from the beginning of our country all the way until we actually fight the Civil War. And this is idea of who actually has more power. Is it the federal government or is it the state governments? And this is playing out right here in these two acts. The Alien and Sedition Act, by the way, the federal government went way too far with these acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. But the states, Kentucky and Virginia, led by Jefferson, Virginia was led by Jefferson, they should have waited for the courts to rule it unconstitutional. Instead, they said, no. We don't agree that the federal government has authority over us. And so if we don't like a law that the federal government passes, or if we believe it's unconstitutional, we just simply won't obey it. Well, that's not how, you can't have a country that way. You cannot have a country. And ultimately, we're going to fight a civil war over these issues, over who has more power. Is it the federal government or is it the state government? But I want you to see, guys, this doesn't just happen 5 and 10 years before the Civil War. This is something that goes all the way back to our founding. This is something we argued over way early in our history. Ultimately, though, this controversy is going to lead to Jefferson winning the presidency. Okay, so the Federalists are out. Adams loses the election. Jefferson wins and becomes president. And why that's important is we see for the first time in our history the transition of power between one party and another. Now, we don't think anything of that today, just like in this past election. You know, whether you were for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, either way you look at it, nobody thought there was going to be violence in the streets because one party took over from another. You know, the presidency was run by Democrats. For 8 years, Barack Obama was a Democrat, ran the presidency. Well, then Hillary Clinton ran as a Democrat, but she lost. And so the Republicans took over. Well, it was a peaceful transition of power. And the reason we take that for granted, guys, goes all the way back to this period when Jefferson takes over for Adams. It's peaceful. We don't have fights in the streets. And you may say, well, what's the big deal, Mr. Cannon? Why is that a big deal at all? The big deal is, for much of human history, that is how you would have transitions of power. It would be through violence. But here we didn't have it. Here in America, we show that, yeah, we got the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which are bad news, but in the end, our country can survive because people will obey the law. They will obey the law. And so we have that right here as Jefferson takes over as a Democratic Republican, the Federalists lose power and the Democratic Republicans gain power. Okay? Okay, so the bottom line is we have several different topics that we've covered here. The last topic we need to cover is this topic of John Marshall and judicial review. And basically what happens here is John Marshall is going to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after Adams leaves the presidency. And as Chief Justice, he's going to help increase the power of the federal government drastically. We're going to see the federal government become much more powerful. We're going to see the court become much more powerful because of John Marshall. One of the biggest cases in the Marshall Court was this case called Marbury versus Madison. And in Marbury versus Madison, it was a case that established the idea of judicial review. Now, that's a big word, but or two words here, but it's a big term. All that means is that the courts, and specifically the Supreme Court, as the final say, can rule acts of the other branches unconstitutional. Okay, what's the big deal, you say? All right, so if Congress passes a law, if the people of America want the law, if all of Congress votes for the law, but the Supreme Court says that law violates the Constitution, that law is thrown out. That's judicial review. Judicial review is the ability to throw a law out, to get rid of a law that the court views as unconstitutional. The same thing is true with the executive decisions. If the president makes an executive order that the Supreme Court rules unconstitutional, that order is thrown out. Just to show you how powerful that is, and how that affects us even today. Just a few years ago, most states in America had a law against gay marriage. Gay marriage was illegal in most states in America. It was legal in some states, but in most states, including South Carolina, it was illegal. If you looked at the polls, most South Carolinians did not want gay marriage. The people of South Carolina did not want it as a majority. We had a law against it, but a case went to the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court ruled that laws against gay marriage violate the Constitution. So therefore, all 50 states, immediately, gay marriage was legal. That's how powerful the court is. And that's partly because of John Marshall. John Marshall is going to help make the court that powerful with this ruling called this ruling called Marbury v. Madison, which establishes judicial review. You need to understand that. Judicial review. The idea that you can rule a law unconstitutional. Okay? The last bullet there says the Madison-led Supreme Court. It should say Marshall. The Marshall-led Supreme Court is also going to make several other rulings that give more power to the federal government. They do this time and time again. We're not going to get into all of these rulings. You don't need to know them by name, but what you do need to know is that the Marshall Court, every time they make a ruling, it ruled in favor of the federal government gaining power. So as we move forward in history, we're not going to see the federal government lose power. We're actually going to see the federal government gain more and more power, and the courts are going to give them more and more power as time goes on. So that is what we have covered in this particular lesson. We went all the way through the first two political parties led by Hamilton and Jefferson, the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. We then looked at John Adams' presidency, and we ended by looking at the John Marshall Court and this idea of judicial review. Just to finish up on a story that I think is a really interesting one, because we talked about John Adams. You know, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are going to run against each other in that election of 1800, and Jefferson is actually going to win. And these two guys were really good friends with each other. Some might even say they were best friends. But that particular election was pretty brutal. You had Jefferson's people making up rumors about Adams, and Adams' people were spreading these rumors about Jefferson fathering a child with one of his slaves. Adams himself didn't believe that, but his people were spreading that rumor, which, by the way, turned out to be more than likely true. But these two men, after the election was over, they didn't speak to each other for 20 years. So these best friends basically become enemies. And then towards the end of their lives, thankfully, John Adams began writing letters to Jefferson, and Jefferson wrote Adams back. And over the last years of their life, they wrote dozens and dozens of letters to each other. And these letters tell us a lot about the time period, and they also show that these two friends who became enemies are now friends again. And the crazy thing about the end of their life is that they both died on the same day. They died on July the 4th. And it happened to be the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. July the 4th, 1826. They both died on that day, the 50th anniversary of the founding of our country. And those two men had as much impact on the founding of our country as anybody did. Adams and Jefferson, who helped found this country, are going to die on its birthday. Its 50th birthday. That's just one of those crazy events in history that's hard to not share. So I wanted to share that with you in this lesson. Good luck with the questions, and as always, if you get stuck, make sure you message your teacher and let them know what you need help with. Bye.